Mythical Island has had wildly different views when it first came out, but now that time has passed and the hype has died down, people have since had many different criticisms of the song. Going through this island was no walk in the park, as it's a very interesting song with a lot of really out there monsters. Let's go ahead and see what this island is all about. So with bad, we only found one track to be actually justifiably bad. For the sake of criticism though, we did find a few mediocre picks. Ping Hao, like I said, is not bad, it just isn't all that good. The only thing it does is add a tiny bit of flourish in the beginning, and that's really it. It's a monster that's just entirely held back by its concept, as you can't do a whole lot with a sonar sound without coming off as intrusive, so it's kind of stuck being a painfully simple flourish monster. Weasel is really boring and adds nothing to the song. All it does is just fill in space where Crunchy doesn't play in, and it's not needed at all, and is a waste of a slot. Slap is entirely carried by its instrument. The rhythm that they gave this thing is really boring and uninspired and doesn't do justice to the build-up of the song. Also, it has a really awkward cut-off that makes the transition from this verse to the next verse more jarring. This one pains me to say because I actually love this track, but I have to stay fair and unbiased. Cherubal's first track cutting off halfway through the verse is not a good idea, since it's crucial for the verse's tone and atmosphere. It cutting off messes with the flow of the song and makes things far too empty in the second half of the verse. I think what they should have done is just have the first track play throughout the whole thing and give the flourish track to Bazinga. I mentioned this before, but we only found one track that legitimately harms the song, and it's a shocking Bazinga pick, but very justifiable. The track in question here is the third track in the Cherubal verse. Most of the track is fine, but that sour note at the beginning just ruins this monster's chances at ranking high. This island does indeed use dissonance a bit, but absolutely not during this verse. There's absolutely no reason why this note had to be sour, and there is no excuse for it damaging the tone of the verse and just clashing with everything as a result. Like I said, the only issue with Bazinga on this island is just that one note, but it really just goes to show how in music every note counts. This isn't going to be like most islands we've talked about. Most islands tend to have one or two really bad, sometimes fatal flaws that drag the song as a whole, but Mythical doesn't really have that. Instead, Mythical just has a lot of little things that stack up. Let me show you what I mean. The first issue is a common criticism I see a lot, but I do have to agree, and that is the Crunchy verse lacks any sort of foundation. There's nothing that fills in the air or provides any sort of drive to that verse. This is an issue because it leads the verse to be disconnected from the rest of the song and kind of awkward. It's a similar issue to the Tweedle verse on Fire Oasis. The second problem we saw was the transition from the Bazinga to the Cherubal verse. It just straight up doesn't exist. There's nothing providing any sort of transition, which makes the song feel very jarring at that point. Third issue was the aforementioned sour note, so I won't go over it again. And lastly, and most egregious of them all, the song doesn't really have any sort of ending. They chose to just recycle the bridge from before and have that be what finishes the song. That is not a satisfying conclusion to the song at all, since that was a transitional bridge to get into the climax of the song. A song needs to have a good intro, which is what hooks you into listening to it in the first place, but as well as a fitting end, since that's going to be your lasting impression of the song. Mythical misses big time on this. It really does need a proper end. Well, like I said, none of these are island ruining problems, but they do stack up against it. Okay, so for good monsters, holy cow, we have some bangers. Bazinga has its problems, but those first two tracks are just straight up S tier. A perfect counterline, a perfect tone setter, a perfect focus to the verse. It just makes the build up of the song and pairs masterfully well with Strombonen and Yostrich, without taking away from either of them. Sporo is the weirdest percussionist in the entirety of MSM. Its instrument of choice includes a taiko, but also this really weird synthesized flute, I believe? How on earth they did that is beyond me, but it works surprisingly well and makes up 90% of the song's build up in the middle. Then it dials it down for the Cherubal verse, and those bassy hits just work so much at accenting the many monsters playing alongside of it. Masterfully put together and should not be overlooked in the slightest. Cherubal minus the cutoff is still such a lovely track in filling in the air and making up the dreamy and peaceful feel of the verse. Catalyst is such a charming monster. Its synth harp is really out there, but it works for both the atmosphere in the beginning, the build up later on, the flourish for Cherubo. It just does everything it needs to do, and it's great at what it does. Crunchy on its own isn't anything to really talk about, but I do have to admit that Crunchy providing a lead is really important to his verse, and without it, that verse just has no drive whatsoever. Nerve does a great job adding on to Crunchy and being a nice and simple atmospheric accompaniment. Then its second track provides a song with tension that works wonders for the build-up of the bridge. Hehehe is such a perfect filling monster. Despite its goofy nature, it does a really good job adding to the ambient feel of both verses it plays in, and pairing amazingly well with the others. Also, the laugh at the start is really charming and funny. Bleatnik is my favorite monster on the island. The first track is similar to Nerve, being an accompaniment to Crunchy, but it's not really standing out. That second track though, it's so perfect at adding on to the dreamful and ambient feel of the verse, while being such an out there and creative vocal without overdoing it and just fitting right in perfectly. This monster adds depth, charm, and personality. It's just so good. So I'm going to be honest here. We argued for a while on what the best monster on the island is, and well, we could never decide between Gajoob, Yostrich, and Strombonen. So in the end, we chose all three. Starting with Gajoob, well, it's the entire foundation of the song. Not only that, but the articulation of the notes themselves makes it shockingly really interesting and dynamic and complex, accenting everything else, playing with it and making the verses it plays in either more lively or soulful, just perfect in every way. Strombonen that provides the song with its main lead, providing all the power and energy of the climax, yet still fitting in the more ambient beginning and letting the others have their moments. Not only that, but its track in the Cherubo verse is just perfection, taking a backseat and providing a strong supportive track, so the whole verse plays out much more majestic. Oh, and its instrument of choice is perfect for this song. And finally, Yostrich, providing the song with that strong, enchanting, and mystifying counter melody. It's one of the best performances in the entire game. And that ending dissonant note at the end of this track is just mwah, it's so good. And its unison with Bleatnik in that verse is just perfection. It's rare that we ever give two monsters the number one spot, let alone three, but all three absolutely deserve it and are just absolute highlights. So that's Mythical. It's really interesting, but does it pass? Yes, it does indeed. It has its problems, but it's nowhere near enough to drag it down a whole lot. I just can't really say it's one of the greats. Well, that's that. Do you agree or disagree? Do we take one giant leap for Monsterkind or trip and land on our faces? Let me know in the comments below. Well, that's it from me, and I'll see you in the next one.